everybody. Migration is back in the news. A couple of days ago, J.D. Vance was in Europe, in Munich, attacking Europe over its migration policy. Meanwhile, European politicians have slammed Vance's call to be inclusive of far-right parties, quote unquote, which are hostile to immigration. Immigration is really one of the most controversial issues of our age, perhaps of any age, as is underlined by my guest, Ian Goldin, one of the great thinkers on globalization. He has a new book out. It was out in the US this week, The Shortest History of Migration. Ian Goldin is joining us from Oxford, where he lives and teaches. Ian, what do you make of this latest Vance spat in Europe? Is it something new, or is it just more of the same?
I think it is an escalation of previous trends. For the US to come to Europe and talk about domestic policies is a change in not only in tone and intensity, but also in diplomacy. Politicians don't tend to go to other countries. European politicians don't go to the US and tell the US how to run itself. And so I think it is different when a vice president of the US comes to Europe and comments very directly about individuals, meets with far-right leaders, and basically tries to advise Europe on what to do. So I think it is different. It's a big step up from what we've seen before. And it's very polarizing, of course.
This term far right, Ian, it's not a term that I know you invented, you just used it. Is it appropriate to describe these anti-immigrant parties in Europe and indeed in the US? The AfD, of course, in Germany, the Reform Party in the UK, the MAGA movement in America. Are they all premised on hostility to immigration?
Well, I think, migration unites parties across the political spectrum, and anti-immigration is certainly not the preserve of far-right parties. Even the Labour Party in the UK at the moment has come out as very hostile to immigration. So it's not something which is the preserve of far-right parties. But I think what is different about Vance's visit to the UK is he met with the AfD leader in Germany. He didn't meet with the leader of the government. So this was a big change. He's the only major global leader that's met with the AfD. So it's a big change in the tone and in the emphasis. And similarly, we've seen members of the cabinet of President Trump, like Elon Musk, endorsing the Reform Party in the UK and pumping up what I think are legitimately described as far-right parties on the political spectrum in Europe. But as you say, it's not the exclusive domain of the far right to be anti-immigrant. This is sweeping the board across the spectrum in many European countries and in the US. The Democrats were also pretty anti-immigration.
Ian, you brought up the M word, Musk. You have something in common with him. You're a South African migrant who has made good in the West. There's something very odd about Musk. Maybe you can make more sense of it, particularly given that you have one of the things in common. But let me just ask the question. On the one hand, of course, he is the poster child for globalization, for migration. He was brought up in South Africa, came to the US, made a fortune, now is the richest man in the world. On the other hand, he seems to be the funder of all these reactionary anti-immigrant parties. I'm less interested in Musk, actually, and more in the forces driving him. Is this contradictory? On the one hand, we have examples of highly successful globalized figures like Musk. On the other hand, guys like him are actually funding anti-immigrant groups. What's going on here?
I mean, there's a lot to be said. But, firstly, Musk, of course, is an immigrant himself, just like Trump's grandfather was to the US, just like many members of the cabinet's forebearers were. And so there's a contradiction with people who really owe their histories and where they are to immigration being so anti-immigrant. Musk personally, I happen to, not only do we come from the same town and have gone to the same high school in Pretoria, South Africa, but I've met him. He came to Oxford. If you look on the Oxford Martin School website, you'll see a conversation we had when he brought the first Tesla up to Oxford. And I've been to SpaceX to his headquarters to visit him in many years before. I think he's moved a long way in the last years, and it's difficult to explain that. But clearly, what he's saying today is not the same as he was saying in 5-10 years ago. And he is, as you've indicated, and others like him, Peter Thiel and a number of others, are very strong supporters, not only of MAGA, but of their similar parties in Europe. I think it is a new force. The amounts of money these people have is very significant. And so they do make a real impact on politics. Indeed, it's likely that Musk directly through his giving made a real impact on the US presidential election. So it is a new tendency. Of course, rich people have always given to political parties. They've owned media and many things like that. But this, I think, is a whole new level of engagement where extremely rich people can influence outcomes.
The subtitle of your book, The Shortest History of Migration, is When, Why, and How Humans Moved from the Prehistoric Peopling of the Planet to Today and Tomorrow's Migrants. It's an ambitious book. It's a short book. This series is excellent and getting important subjects in manageable, accessible books. Has something changed over the last 50 or 100 years, Ian? I mean, humans have always been on the move, haven't they?
Yeah, there's been dramatic changes. One change, of course, is the creation of borders, as we know them today, and passports, border controls. That's relatively recent. Before the First World War, people could basically move around, and there weren't the controls, identity documents that we know today. So that's one major change that's happened over the past 10, 20 years. Secondly, there's many more countries. There's well over 100 countries. The number of borders has greatly increased. Of course, the cost of travel and the risk associated with travel, I don't mean dangerous crossings across the Rio Grande or the Sahara. I mean air travel, ship travel, and so on, in motor vehicles has gone down dramatically. So and the size of the world population has increased. So we have this situation where, although the share of people migrating hasn't really budged over the last 100 years, it's about 3% of the world's population. And you see that in this figure that you've brought up in a timely way. I reproduced the updated version of this in the book, around 3% constant. But the number of people has increased because 3% of 8 billion people is clearly a much bigger number than 3% of what it was around 2 billion 100 years ago. So that massive change leads to the numbers seeming much bigger. But the big change has really been that the way that we think about migrants today is very different to the way it was thought about in, for example, the age of mass migration, when the US, 25% of the US was migrant in the period 1850 to before the First World War.
But wasn't it also fair to say in the US that there have been cycles of anti-immigrant politics and culture, where at points the border was open and then it got slammed shut again?
Yes, very much so. Particularly in the post-Second World War period, that was the case. And we have what we might see again now, which is this two-handed approach. In the one hand, politicians trying to be very strong on migration and saying things which they feel appeals to voters, and at the same time, in practice, very different things happening. And we've seen that in many countries where the rhetoric on migration is very strong, where there's attempts sort of to show that one's doing a lot by policing, by deporting, by building walls, etc. But the numbers of migrants actually go up because of the need for migrants. And, you know, the stronger the economy, the more migrants you need. Also, the older the economy, as the workforce ages, the more migrants you need. So it's extremely important to keep these flows up. And of course, we also know that migrants are the source of economic dynamism. They're much more likely to create startups. It's no accident that Elon Musk is a migrant, but well over half of the Silicon Valley tech entrepreneurs are migrants. No, it's a characteristic of migrants that they're much more productive typically. They're much more likely to invest and to start up businesses. So if you want to have a dynamic economy, and if you want to look after the elderly, and you want to pick your agriculture, you need migrants. And and I'm sure that even those in the government of the US that are violently anti-immigrant recognize those things. So that's where the tension will be played out.
Yeah, you had an interesting piece about, and you just touched on it earlier, the truth about migration. You argue today's rich countries owe much of their success to the contributions of migrant workers. Is there any argument against migration, Ian? I mean, you're clearly on one side of the debate, even if you've authored this short history. What's the best argument against allowing migrants into your country?
Well, I'm not utopian in the sense I do believe that we need border controls and we need to regulate the number of migrants can come in. And clearly we need to keep some people out, criminals and others from our societies. So, and sex traffickers and other sorts of people. But I think it's also the case that where we get real problems is that the migrants can put a lot of pressure in the short term on resources. So you see this in housing markets. People are feeling a lack of affordability of homes in dynamic cities, San Francisco, Vancouver, Toronto, New York, London, and many. And it is true that in part, this is because of the number of immigrants in these cities. Now, the immigrants also contribute and make these places dynamic. So it's a virtuous circle. But one has to address the concerns of citizens that say, I cannot afford a home, or public transport is too crowded, or the lines are too long when I go to emergency services at the hospital. So these are real concerns. And I think the challenge that we face is that investment in resources, in public services, in housing, in transport and so on, hasn't kept pace with population growth in dynamic cities, particularly, and people are feeling the pinch. So that's one big issue. There's not much truth in the fact that I deal with this in the book, that immigrants undermine wages. In fact, there's quite a lot of evidence that they create jobs and lift wages. But there's also a short-term and a long-term issue. And I see you've pulled up the city report that I did as well. That the issue is that the costs are often local. So people feel in a particular locality that overwhelmed by the number of immigrants. And the benefits are national and longer term. They take some time. You know, the immigrants build the houses, they work in the hospitals, they demand goods and services. So they're buying things, they're building things, they're creating things. But that doesn't all happen at the same place at the same time. And so I believe that federal governments, national governments, need to support immigration much more by investing in these resources. It's a national good, but the costs can be local, and I see that as the main negative. The other important thing is to distinguish between migrants and refugees. A lot of the problems that societies have is because these things are conflated. When I think of migrants, I think of economic migrants, of students, of people coming that are going to benefit themselves and the countries, but have a choice. So if you keep them out, that's your choice. Refugees are a different thing. Refugees have a legitimate fear of their lives if they do not get refugee status. And so I think governments need very different policies for refugees than they do for migrants. And part of the challenge, I think, is that that's been conflated. So when in the UK, for example, where I am, the talk of migrants, often people are thinking about refugees. They're not thinking about economic migrants, but economic migrants are kept out because people fear refugees. Refugees is a humanitarian issue, and I think that needs agreement about how many we want to accept and burden sharing between countries.
You've mentioned the US, the UK. Your book breaks down immigration around the world. You argued in your big think piece that the US is home to the largest absolute numbers of migrants, 51 million. Is the US still symbolically the place where this pro-anti-migration argument gets played out? Trump, of course, has been outspoken, and arguably it was the reason why he was just elected president again.
Yes, I think it is the place where it's being played out. You know, it's the most migrants. It's a society we've always thought of historically as being constructed by migrants. It's an immigrant country. Of course, it displaced an indigenous people that were living there before, but it is a society now that's basically come from elsewhere, and so it is being played out. And I think the future dynamism of the US, where the US is going to be in 10, 20, 30 years' time, is going to depend to a large extent on its policies on immigration. So if it throttles the source of its lifeblood that's created the country that we know is a dynamic, world-leading economy, it's going to fall back. And so it is absolutely central to the debate how this plays out in the US.
Yeah, I wonder, we've talked about Musk. Musk is, as always, a little bit more complicated than he seems on immigration. On the one hand, he's obviously opposed, certainly, to mass immigration. On the other hand, as a tech billionaire, he's sympathetic to qualified people coming into the country. And there seems to be a division within the Republicans between Musk and people like Steve Bannon, who seem to be opposed to all forms of immigration. Is this an important debate, conflict, Ian, that you think will be played out on the American right?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important. I mean, both Musk and Steve Bannon have said pretty harsh things about the other side of this debate. So it's pretty ferocious. Musk gets it that the US needs tech workers. I mean, the tech industry is dependent on Indian and many other programmers and others that they get in large numbers. And I'm sure he's also aware, looking around the US, that the leaders of many of these firms, including Microsoft and Google, are immigrants. So as is he. So I think he understands. He's been mainly focusing on the need for high-skilled immigrants. And Steve Bannon is taking the sort of fundamentalist MAGA line, which is they will take out jobs. Of course, they don't take out jobs; they create jobs. So I think it's pretty fundamental, and it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. My own guess is that Musk is going to win this particular debate, both because he's right at the center of power, and because the businesses around him also get it. For agriculture, it's absolutely essential that they're immigrants. Across the economy, I think business will be crying out. And interestingly enough, as I highlight in the Project Syndicate piece, a lot of Republican governors have been asking for immigration.
Yeah, it's interesting. Ian, you mentioned you and Musk were born in the same South African town. You worked for a while for Mandela. You're all too familiar with South African history. It's increasingly, South Africa is becoming a controversial subject on the right in America, as I'm sure you know. We had Simon Cooper on the show, another South African born thinker, who noted, I think he wrote a piece for the FT recently, bringing all these South Africans together in the hostility to certain groups of people. How do you, in your shortest history of migration, how do you place the colonial experience? Were the white Europeans who showed up and conquered Africa, were they migrants, or are they something different?
They were migrants. The migrant armies, migrant business people, migrant settlers. Some of them, particularly in Australia, were convicts that were shipped out to Australia. They often were, at times, the underdogs. They were doing it out of desperation. I mean, my grandparents migrated to South Africa because they were, if they'd stayed in my father's side in Lithuania and Russia, where they were all killed. Those that remained, and those on my mother's side that stayed in Austria and Germany were all killed. So these were migrant refugees, and many people around that were also settling elsewhere were refugees. So they weren't all just business people trying to rip off and extract industries in the countries. But the impact, of course, of colonialism and the impact of this was devastating. I mean, goes back to the first settlers in the Americas, which have been really effectively written about by many people. 600 Spaniards who landed in the Americas most probably led to the death of over 20 million Native Americans through guns, what Jared Diamonds calls guns, germs, and steel, but mainly through germs. And similar things were happening in Africa. And of course, before the colonial period, there was slavery, which is a terrible stain on humanity. And over 20 million people were forced into this absolutely inhumane system across the Atlantic. Before that, I mean, slavery was not new; it had been existing from before the first millennia. But the industrialization of it, the sort of scale and the horror of it, and the number of people that died in transit, probably over 2 million people, was new. And so, yeah. I emphasize in the book that not all migration is good, and not all is, and that migration is often a very unhappy experience, a brutal experience. But we need to try and understand this historical context, and certainly immigration today, we need to make more humane, better, and we need to recognize that it's often what the migrants have to do. They're doing it out of need to support their families, to support themselves, to create better opportunities for themselves and future generations. And the recipient countries need it too. And the question is, can we better manage it?
Do the two histories need to be seen side by side and as a narrative? Lots of images of North Africans and Sub-Saharan Africans coming to Europe. We have famous images from the beach of children dying on the beach. Should we be thinking about this counter migration? Maybe that's the right word, of Africans coming to Europe as a consequence of the European colonization of Africa and the original migration of some Europeans to Africa, to places like South Africa?
I mean, there clearly are some links, but I think, Africa is what it is today as a result not only of its colonial history, slavery clearly, which often was driven by African slave, kings and things. They were the armies enforcing it before Africa was colonized. But it also is a much more, there are much more recent explanations for it as well. I mean, massive mismanagement of resources in Africa, the despotic actions of governments. The refugees that come into Europe are coming because they are in fear of their lives, often in the countries that they're in. Whether it's being called up into the Eritrean army, whether it's what's happening in Somalia and Sudan. These people are escaping to protect their lives and maybe to sustain people that are left behind through sending back remittances. So one could make the arguments that conflict and those despotic regimes are mirroring practices that come back from colonial times. But I think we need to look at more recent examples. There are many African countries, there are 52 countries in Africa. There are many African countries where people are not refugees. In South Africa, incidentally, refugees are flooding into South Africa from neighboring countries like Zimbabwe, for example. So it's not the case, I think, that there's necessarily a correlation. In order to stop refugees coming from places, we need to fix the problems in those places as much as we can. The same is true. A lot of the refugees in Europe have come from Syria, for example. Now they're going back to Syria. Many of them, something like a third of them, want to go back in the short term. Afghanistan. These are the refugees arriving in Europe.
Your book is a very personal book. You dedicate it to my grandparents. You mentioned them earlier. People came from Lithuania to South Africa, to my grandparents who gave up everything to flee. Do you think you write this book with the sensibility of certainly of a relative of migrants and a man who's migrated a couple of times himself? You seem to be a citizen of the world, not necessarily linked to anywhere in particular. This is a labor of love in many ways, this book, Ian, isn't it?
It is. It's, I wrote another book on migration in 2012, Exceptional People, How Migration Shaped Our World and Will Define Our Future, because I want to engage in this debate. And when this publishers came to me with this series and said they'd want one on migrations, I leaped at it because I have been wanting to do another book, a longer book, a deeper book. I learned an enormous amount doing it. It's obviously difficult to compress into 250 pages or something, the whole history of migration, which is everything about humanity, really. But it was a great challenge, and the main aim of my in doing so is to try and raise a sensibility that we're all migrants and that we need to better understand the role of migrants in our own personal histories, in our country's histories, and also somehow recognize that these migrants are not other people. They're not the other. They are where we come from. And I also believe rather fundamentally that it's what makes humans an exceptional species. It's the reason we've thrived. And if we hadn't migrated, we would have died out. Some other species, maybe Neanderthals or Denisovans or others, would have been more successful than we've been. But the reason Homo sapiens is where it is today is because of migration.
So you don't buy the argument that the world is divided into the somewheres and the everywheres, the thesis that some people are locked into a place for generations and others, like yourself or myself for that matter, move around all the time, and we tend to be the elites these days.
I've debated that with David Goodhart, who came.
Yeah, and David's been on the show several times.
Who's argued that case. I think what he's picked up on, which I empathize with and I think is right, is that people have an identity that is based on place, that it's important not to deny that identity or to say that somehow they need to change it through other policies. But I think what it completely fails to pick up on is that firstly, that can be threatened. You think you're of a place and then suddenly you're not anymore. My grandparents thought they were, my mother's parents thought they were absolute Viennese. I mean, my grandfather was on the Viennese opera committee. It didn't help him when they decided to kill all the Jews in Vienna. And similarly, my grandparents thought they were upright, on my father's side, upright members of the Lithuanian community running a small business. That didn't help them. So that can change very, very rapidly. We need to recognize that identity can be threatened, and we need to empathize with those who are threatened, but also that it gets mixed over, that it doesn't threaten. There's no evidence that having immigrants in your society makes you a weaker society or threatens your community. Indeed, if you want your community to thrive, you're going to need immigrants. You're going to need them not only to do some of the work that your community doesn't want to do, whether it's picking fruit or cleaning the floors of a hospital, but you're also going to need them to keep the place dynamic. And that's incidentally what these governors in the US who are calling for more immigrants have recognized about their dying towns in the Midwest and elsewhere. So they need immigrants to keep their communities alive. And so I think it's much too simplistic, let's say, to say that because you have an identity based on place, the conclusion is therefore you need to keep immigrants out of your society as a whole.
The
And
book
by
is
the
full
way,
of. Sorry, go on.
yeah, the dynamic cities, of course, are great examples of places which thrive on being melting pots. And people are drawn to them. The magnetism of them is quite phenomenal. And in the extreme end, there's a place like Dubai, which I was in last week, 90% immigrant. And, the Emiratis are very happy.
Well, although in Dubai, one of the reasons for that is that they don't give citizenship to.
Yeah, that's a
immigrant
different
workers.
matter. And I don't I don't argue in the book anywhere that you have to give citizenship to everyone that comes and works in your country. I think that's a national decision to what extent you want to give citizenship to people.
The book is full of stories. You mentioned your grandparents who escaped Nazi Europe. You have stories about the kinder transport, for example, human stories of migrants. Tell me about the kinder transport story in the book.
It's a desperately sad story. These parents who recognized that they were going to be killed and that sent their kids off as to an unknown future. It's desperately sad as well because the UK actually prevented a number of these trains from coming. So the UK was obviously fully aware of what was happening in the concentration camps, what was happening in Nazi Germany, but restricted entry to a very limited number of people. And the bravery of the parents in saying farewell to their kids. Sometimes they might have hoped to see them again, but many, I think, feared they wouldn't. And of course, these children who then came were often adopted by others, foster care of others, and who've created. I've met a number of them. They're all in their 90s now, and they are or late 80s. They are dying out as a group, but quite phenomenal, and many of them incredibly successful in how they've adapted to the future. But it's a desperate story of early refugees, of child refugees, and what they went through and what their families went through, the desperation what people will do just to keep alive. I mean, similarly, incidentally, with my father's parents, when they decided to leave Russia, they sent kids to different places. Some went to the US, some went to Argentina, some went to South Africa, some went to the UK where they most really weren't allowed to stay. It's part of a sort of risk assurance policy. And in those days, of course, you really didn't have a clue as to when you'd hear from them again. You'd get a letter years later if you were lucky.
The book isn't only full of heartbreaking stories. I was in Valparaiso recently. I went to visit Pablo Neruda's
amazing, yeah,
home. I don't know if you've been there. It's designed like a ship, and it's dominated by the theme of travel and of ships. I know you use him and Milan Kundera, the Czech writer, as examples of artists who bring the sensibility of migration to their art. What is it about guys like Neruda and Kundera that can make the cultural argument for migration?
I think these people are incredible creators, and I don't think many, most migrants, most people just don't have their talent to do that. So they were incredible creators, able to synthesize. I think, by the way, someone like Elif Shafak now is doing a similar thing. As well.
Anglo-Turkish writer.
The English-Turkish writer, yeah, who lives in London. So these are just fantastic creative people who are able to articulate through their narratives the experience of migrants and to communicate across languages and experiences. I don't think it's anything particularly about being a migrant. I just think they're exceptional talents, and because they're exceptional talents, they often challenge authority. They're outside the ordinary, and often they're forced into exile, as Kundera and Neruda and Shafak have been forced into exile. we had similar things in South Africa with many great writers forced into exile. So yeah, these are just wonderful authors and musicians. People like Hugh Masekela and many others have done a similar thing.
Yeah, we'll have to see what happens in Trump's America. It might generate a new wave of immigration. Finally, Ian, let's cast our eyes forward. The book is not just about today's migrants, but tomorrow's migrants. What might the future hold for migration? Are there some conceptual differences as the 21st century evolves in 25 years? By 2050, will the debate be the same? Will migration still be the same? Could technology change it? I mean, Musk, of course, is trying to settle on Mars. Well, in a sense, will be migrants on other planets. Might that be the difference in 25 years' time?
I don't think so. You know, it'd be easier to settle at the South Pole than it would be on Mars. I mean, it's sort of an extreme. Maybe one or two people get there, but I don't think that's an option, or even the moon. I think there will be major differences. I think the debates we have today will seem rather out of date by 2050. I mean, one of the major drivers of that is going to be demographic change. We're seeing this very rapid reduction in birth rates in well over half the countries of the world. We're going to see big labor contractions in labor markets in North America, in Europe, across Asia as well over that sort of period of time. And that's, I think, going to make people more aware as societies age. At the same time, people will live much longer and healthier lives, hopefully. But certainly longer lives, and it's going to lead to great shortages of labor. We're already seeing shortages of labor in many markets. So that's going to be one key difference. I think the fragility of different places is also going to be played out. I think extreme climate and weather is going to lead to very different migration patterns. Oceans are going to rise. There'll be floodplains, intense weather, extreme droughts, lack of water, etc. Already by 2050, I think that's going to play out quite dramatically. You know, by the end of the century, a place like Miami is going to be very threatened. So within a big country like the US, you see movement, but within Europe, we'll begin to see this played out as well. So I think extreme weather will influence migration. It's difficult to know how the geopolitics and conflicts and things will wear, but I think that's going to continue to be a major factor. AI will have an impact. That AI is likely to do a lot of repetitive jobs, manufacturing, call centers. None of that will be people anymore. But I think the jobs that people will want in our societies, especially as our societies get wealthier, like hospitality, like elderly care, like massages. These are what economists call non-tradable services. And we'll need more and more of those. And they cannot be done remotely. And they are unlikely by 2050, I think, to be done by machines. So we're not going to give our children, we're not going to give our parents, and we're not going to ask for a machine to give us a massage or a meal, I think, not in bulk form anyway, by 2050. And so that's going to beg the question of who's going to do these things. And so I think we're likely to see in Europe, in North America, and in many parts of Asia, the debates we have now about keeping people out turned on their head into how do we get more people into our societies. Population will start declining very rapidly, and workforces certainly will decline before populations decline. And that's going to lead, I think, to very different debates.
Yeah, we may have a reverse where people are forced to come to countries as opposed to actively discouraged. And finally, Ian, you write about the history of passports. You say that they began in the early 20th century, and that's where we can trace the foundations of theories, or Orwellian theories of Big Brother. with our increasingly sophisticated technology of data, increasingly we don't need passports. It seems when we go to the airport, they know everything about us before even we show up. How will that play out when we're more and more incapable of hiding from the camera and we essentially become data? How will this play out in your future history of migration?
Well, I think it's going to play out differently in different places. And the big question is, how much do we trust those that have the information? So I think how we feel about it in Europe is going to be different to how people feel about it, say, in China. But I think also it could lead to a lot smoother. I mean, one of the amazing experiments of the late 20th century, which we'll see played out in the coming decades continually, is, within 27 countries in Europe, there's no passport controls. So passports are basically being thrown away for movement within Europe.
Although we just did a history of Schengen, and there's even in Germany now, there's a reaction against that.
There is a reaction. There is a reaction, and there's attempts to sort of, for short times, to impose controls, partly to play to this rhetoric of being strong on immigration. But it's tiny when you look at the numbers of people that are being stopped on Schengen borders. I'm not talking about the outer border of Europe. I'm talking about within Europe, within the Schengen area. It's tiny. It's much less than a tiny fraction of 1% are stopped. There's just not the border force. There's not the infrastructure. There's not the controls within Europe. And I think that it's proved to be a remarkable, successful experiment. So I think we will see much more surveillance on the outer rims of countries outside of Europe, the border of Europe as a whole. We're going to see much more surveillance at borders and things. I think that's right. And I hope it becomes part of a bigger bargain in which we accept more people into our societies. We treat them more fairly. We protect them. We give them rights. But we also say we don't want some people to come. And then we are able to control it, and gives people a confidence within countries that they don't feel that they're out of control, but that we can have more people and we can control who comes. So I do see a silver lining potentially in this, if it's used in a humane and effective way. And of course, the risk is that it's not, and that people are continually forced to do illegal passages, dangerous passages, die crossing the Mediterranean or trying to get into the US across the Rio Grande. And that's really what I believe we need to work against.
There you have it. Amidst all this controversy about migration, some wisdom from Ian Goldin. He has his new book out. It's out in the US this week. The Shortest History of Migration: When, Why, and How Humans Move from the Prehistoric People of the Planet to Today and Tomorrow's Migrants, written by Ian Goldin, who is from a family of migrants. Ian, congratulations on the new book, and love to get you back on. You're always doing such interesting work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and all the best to you and to all your listeners.